Upside down became a way of life in the U.S., says undocumented immigrant Joshua Casillas, before the University of Monterrey here in Mexico welcomed him home. Joshua says he voluntarily left the United States recently after losing hope, he says, that he'd ever achieve his dream of becoming a doctor north of the border.
I tried to work hard at the U.S. for it, wasn't able to succeed on it.
He says he grew up in the U.S. fearing that he'd be caught and deported from his hometown, Houston, Texas. Joshua had been raised in Houston after his mother brought him to the U.S. as a child. He says the stress of possibly being deported became too much by the time he graduated high school, so he self-deported back to Mexico. His decision coming, he says, the night the current U.S. president was elected, a new president promising tough measures against illegal immigration.
We have to stop illegal immigration. We have to do it. We have to do it.
That was a very scary night for me. I ended up crying because I was scared, like I didn't know what was gonna happen to me. The future that I dreamed about, it was kind of over.
There are close to 1 million young undocumented nomads in the United States like Joshua, arriving as children simply looking for a better life here. They got the name Dreamers back in 2001 under protective legislation in the U.S. called the DREAM Act that granted them a pathway to citizenship. Then in 2012, they had been given further hope of staying in the U.S. under then-President Barack Obama's program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA.
It is the right thing to do.
We have to build a wall, folks.
But then current U.S. President Donald Trump effectively ended the DACA program by executive order, telling DACA recipients they must leave the U.S. unless Congress approves $25 billion in funding to complete the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border and for other security measures. But then the U.S. Supreme Court effectively blocked Trump's decision, granting DACA recipients a reprieve from possible deportation. Still, many young dreamers have felt unsure they'll ever be able to stay in the U.S. for good. In the meantime, young people like Joshua had already returned to Mexico. Joshua at first got a job doing construction, saying that he was not able to afford college or becoming a doctor, unless, he says, someone was willing to help him. To the rescue came Oscar-winning Mexican film director Alejandro G. Iñárritu, known for Birdman, The Revenant, and recently for a thought-provoking virtual reality film that puts viewers in the shoes of immigrants risking life to cross the desert into the U.S., a film called Carne y Arena, or Flesh and Sand. Iñárritu would then take a stand against the current U.S. administration's treatment of dreamers by funding Joshua's $75,000 a year college tuition here, as well funding the tuitions of 4 other Dreamer students like Joshua here at the University of Monterrey, in cooperation with the university's Reconocer Scholarship Fund, says the school's development director, Mónica Manzanilla.
Currently, Alejandro González Iñárritu is working very hard. So this year, we're looking forward to bring at least another 5 students to the fund.
Manzanilla says the university, as well as Mexico as a nation, now in a position to benefit greatly from what she calls the U.S. government's failure to recognize the talents of so-called dreamers like Joshua Casillas.
That would be a big win for Mexico.
A big win for Mexico, says its Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and a big loss, he says, for the United States, should it start forcing young immigrants to leave.
Big loss for the U.S., by the way. You'll be exporting human capital for free.
So if dreamers are coming back, we're happy.
Joshua is among more than 500,000 young Mexicans between the ages of 18 and 35 who have returned to Mexico from the U.S. since 2005. Among them recently PAOLA Morales, also a scholarship recipient and med student here at the University of Monterrey. Paolo says it was only last year when she was in the high school marching band playing the saxophone back in Houston, Texas, before the painful goodbye to all her friends and returning to Mexico.
I graduated high school. I did a whole high school over there in Houston, and I graduated with honors, and I was super happy. I was ready to go to college, but then, Trump won, and since I was undocumented, I couldn't continue studying because the risks were just way too high. My parents were like, if you stay here and if anything happens, you get deported, you're not going to come back into the States. And so I was like, that's not a risk I'm willing to take.
Upon arriving in Mexico, Paola says it took some time for local citizens here to warm up to her and her quirky fashion as a self-described cowgirl from Texas.
People here come and they look at me and they look at me weird because I'm wearing my cowgirl boots, but I like them because they're very Texan and it like expresses who I grew up to be, you know? I wasn't born like this, but I grew up to be that person.
But in Mexico, that person many dreamers once were in the U.S. all of a sudden realized that Mexico can seem a totally different world to them. Dreamer Daniel Arenas says he went through that when he returned here. He'd spent his childhood in South Carolina, returning to Mexico alone a few years ago at 18. Daniel was an A student, he says, back in the U.S. with the goal of going to college, until one fateful day when he learned he was not a legal U.S. citizen. The crushing news coming as he went to apply for his driver's license.
And in the application, they were asking for certain things, for certain documents that I didn't have, and my parents made it very clear that I didn't have those type of documents and I wasn't going to be able to get them anytime soon. I felt very, very sad. I was frustrated, and in a way I was confused. And I found out that in the U.S. it was going to be very difficult for me to graduate from a college because I didn't have documents.
Making things worse, Daniel says he couldn't really share his secret with anyone. Daniel was able to enroll at a public university here and has since become a successful interpreter, and has founded a nonprofit support group for returning dreamers called Dream in Mexico that helps dreamers make the transition back to their country that Daniel says initially can be quite frightening.
It's culture shock because you're returning and you're seeing the reality of Mexico. And it's difficult. It would be difficult for any young person. I mean, it's not just dreamers and undocumented youth. It's any young person that would have to make this type of decision of moving to another country. It would be something that's very difficult. We help them find job opportunities and education opportunities here in Mexico. And we believe that the different type of companies that they're getting into or the different universities they're going to be getting into, that's going to be able to help them accomplish their goals.
Daniel says some dreamers returning to Mexico have the advantage of being bilingual and are finding work immediately, even without having gone to college.
They're using their skills of being bilingual and bicultural.
Many have been finding work at call centers like one of Mexico's largest, called Teletec in Mexico City. That employs 2,000 young Mexicans now answering calls from U.S. citizens complaining about cable television or some retail item they bought back in the U.S. Employees here said to make about $750 a month, which many consider a middle-class salary in Mexico.
But there's also other types of jobs that they can get. They're working in the tourist industry. They're working in the software industry as well.
Daniel says the Mexican government has simplified the process for returning dreamers to receive their identification documents that they need to work and start their lives here.
And that way they can get a bank account, rent an apartment, buy a cell phone, all these type of things that you need an identification.
Most dreamers say one thing they all seem to share in common back here in Mexico is an overwhelming sense of freedom. A sense of relief that they no longer have to look over their shoulder in fear of being caught and deported from the United States, says Alejandra Gomez, who has become a journalist here in Mexico City after leaving her life and friends in high school back in the U.S. state of Oregon.
I feel a lot freer in Mexico because in the U.S. I always felt limited, that I couldn't travel, I couldn't leave the country, I couldn't get to know where I was from. There are challenges, for example, like a bad habit here in Mexico is that people whistle and tell you things, so that's something too. Like, I have to cover up myself, especially here in Mexico City. Like, if I'm gonna take the public transportation, I do have to wear more clothes than I did in the U.S.
Indeed, the cowgirl from Texas, Paola Morales, says she thought at first that she had made a big mistake coming back.
I did not want to come back. I was like, no, this is taking a step back in life. Mexico's so corrupt. Mexico is just not the place for me. I'm not gonna grow here. But then I got here and the opportunity that presented itself to me was absolutely unbelievable. I could not believe it. I was completely taken aback. So I was like, this is where I was meant to be and this is where I'm gonna become a doctor.
Paula Morales says new friends that she's made here, like Diana Villarreal, have made her feel like her life is no longer so upside down.
Me da tristeza, o sea, cuando ella me dijo que se tuvo que venir para acá por lo que había pasado, sí me dio bastante tristeza porque no, la gente no se merece ser como tratada de esa forma. Entonces, siento que debe de haber oportunidades para todos.
Though Paula says it's still difficult moving on from the life she once enjoyed in the United States. A video from a friend sums up just how sorry all her friends were to see her go.
I'm sorry, so sorry.
Paula says she misses her friends in the U.S. a lot. And in the end, for future doctor Joshua Casillas, he says even though he felt safer back in Houston, Texas, the fear of being deported always seemed to ruin even the littlest things.
And one of those things is just running over an escalator.
Running up an escalator the wrong way is what Joshua's friends often did for fun back in Houston. But Joshua says he never could try this for fear of being caught and deported. So, as you may have guessed, the first escalator Joshua saw, this moving walkway near campus here in Mexico.
I saw it and I said, oh, I want to do it, and I did it. I can do that in the U.S.
Joshua also now climbs mountains in Mexico, like Monterrey's famed El Cerro de la Silla. He was afraid to try something like this in the U.S.
Something fun, because there was always the maybe. Maybe something bad is going to happen. And that maybe might end up with me being deported and taken away from my family.
Joshua's family back in the U.S., he says, embraces his new life in Mexico, where he says he can reach greater heights than ever before.
Now I have the chance, now I have the freedom. I get the chance to choose. Viva Mexico.